Good afternoon, and welcome to the Jewish Policy Center webinar. I am Shoshana Bryan, Senior Director of the JPC and your host. So life is moving fast, too fast. In the middle of last week, when I invited today's guest to the program, we were talking about the ceasefire in Lebanon, pros and cons, pluses and minuses, how long would it last? But by the time the invitation went out to you on Friday, we were watching the Syrian civil war, which, as you know, began in 2011 and never ended. The war has taken a new and deadly turn. Sunni jihadis, supported by our NATO partner, Turkey, to an unknown but increasingly obvious degree, are trying to oust the regime of Bashar Assad, which is supported by Russia, by Iran, and by Hezbollah. Now, that brings us back to the circle of Israel, Hezbollah, Iran, Russia, Turkey. We're all going around in circles. But fortunately for us, our guest today, EJ Kimball, can handle the shift and the players and some of the really big forces that are shifting in the region. But before we get to EJ, your JPC commercial. The Jewish Policy Center was established in 1985 as a nonprofit organization providing analysis of foreign and domestic policies. Our new motto is policy, not politics. We're going to stick to that. We support a strong American defense capability, US-Israel security cooperation, and missile defense. And aside from our security interests, the JPC advocates for small government, low taxes, free trade, fiscal responsibility, energy security, free speech, and intellectual diversity. We really believe in those last two. Right now, however, our primary job, our most important job, is to support the government of Israel and the IDF in their defense of the people of Israel, making Hamas and its fellow travelers release the hostages, eliminating Hamas and Hezbollah arsenals, and eliminating the ability of either terror group to rearm and to govern captive peoples. You can find us on our website, jewishpolicycenter.org. That's jewishpolicycenter.org. You can read our insight articles and our magazine In Focus Quarterly. You can also find the entire list of our webinar series. Grab a cup of coffee or a glass of wine and binge watch. And now our guest. EJ Kimball is Director of Policy and Strategic Operations for the nonprofit US-Israel Education Association. And he works with the Combat Anti-Semitism Movement, a most relevant organization now and always. His foreign policy and national security experience goes back about 15 years. He previously served as Director of U.S. Operation for the Israel Allies Foundation, where he built a niche of pro-Israel organizations into the kind of go-to resource on Capitol Hill for pro-Israel and Middle East policy. He was Foreign Policy Counsel to Representative Sue Myrick and Staff Director of the Congressional Anti-Terrorism Caucus. In his spare time, not that he has a whole lot, but in his spare time, he is president of EJK Strategies, a national security consulting firm here in Washington. A graduate of Boston University, he earned his JD from Western New England College and received a master's degree in international affairs from the American University School of International Service. I am happy to say, EJ Kimball, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Shoshana, and it's nice to have this conversation with you and with many other people. I'm used to having our private conversations, so very much looking forward to this and appreciate the opportunity to speak to the audience and share about what's going on, which is ever changing. And I would say, thankfully, the topic that we're going to start with is still definitely relevant today, and that being what's happening with the ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon and Hezbollah. And so I wanted to just sort of start off with sort of how we got here, how we got to the ceasefire, and then unpack a few things. What does the ceasefire say? Why would Israel actually agree to this ceasefire rather than completely dismantling Hezbollah? And how the ceasefire is going, which I think is quite interesting. So I will try to be relatively brief on how we got here. So obviously, we all remember the horrific attack on October 7th. On October 8th, Hezbollah began firing rockets at Israel in solidarity with their brethren in Gaza, with Hamas. At the time, there was actually a debate in Israel about whether Israel should go into Gaza first or deal with Hezbollah, because as we saw with the unpreparedness for the attack from Hamas, Israel had been focusing its attention on the north, on Hezbollah, since the end of the most recent war in Lebanon in 2006. And that was viewed as the greater, larger threat due to many factors: Hezbollah's larger arsenal of weapons, the preparedness of their military, the stronger Iranian support. So there was a debate. Obviously, Israel focused on Gaza first. And over the next nearly nine months or so, 9 to 10 months, you essentially had a situation where Hezbollah is firing into Israel and Israel is responding. And there was essentially some unwritten agreements that, depending on what Hezbollah was targeting, Israel would respond in certain ways. So as you can imagine, if they're hitting open fields, Israel would respond one way. If they kill an Israeli, Israel's going to respond a lot tougher. And that basically went on for about 9 months. And then, as I'm sure we all remembered, mid-September, there was the pager attack, followed by the walkie-talkie attack, followed by the bombing and elimination of Hassan Nasrallah, many of the leadership taken out over the next few days and weeks. And about 2 months ago, a ground assault into Lebanon that put Hezbollah really far back on its heels and has led to the ceasefire that we're in. I think it's safe to say that in 8 weeks, from the time of the pager attack, Hezbollah's leadership, much of its arsenal, has been destroyed. Not all of it, and they still are capable, but a lot was destroyed. And Hezbollah, being in a very, very weakened position, has agreed to this ceasefire. So, sort of getting into what does the ceasefire say? So the ceasefire has 13 provisions. It's an agreement between Israel and Lebanon. Lebanon has enforcement requirements. Hezbollah is sort of a party to it. There was conversations, messages given to Hezbollah, but really, if you break it down, this is about Lebanon enforcing certain requirements regarding Hezbollah, their activities, and supposed to take back control of their country. Israel is required to gradually withdraw over 60 days south of the Blue Line, which is essentially the, I'll say border, but it's not an actual border, but that's essentially the division between Israel and Lebanon. Lebanon is to deploy its security and military along all borders, crossing points, and the line that defines southern Lebanon, which, if you're familiar with the topography, the Litani River in Lebanon is essentially that breaking point. One of the interesting aspects of this agreement is that sort of line of demarcation, that Litani River, there's some aspects that are very, very close to Israel's border, specifically near the Galilee, and it's been redrawn so that Hezbollah will be required to be even further back, so that Israeli communities would be safe. Neither Hezbollah nor Israel is allowed to carry out offensive military actions. Only the Lebanese armed forces can operate in southern Lebanon, no Hezbollah. The Lebanese government also is required to be the only group in Lebanon that can purchase weapons, produce weapons, materials for the weapons, all of that under the supervision and control of the government. And all unauthorized facilities for production of weapons, military infrastructure bases need to be dismantled. There's also a committee led by the United States with France that will oversee and assist in the enforcement, which is a change from how things had been operating under the UN Security Council Resolution 1701, which left that primarily to UNIFIL. The US is also to promote some indirect negotiations between Israel and Lebanon to reach a recognized land border. So as I mentioned, really the importance here is the obligations on the Lebanese government to dismantle Hezbollah's factories and weapons depots, and the fact that the Lebanese government agreed to have the Americans oversee the implementation of these commitments. Now, this was not enough for Israel, and the United States provided a side letter to Israel that has some additional guarantees, which include sharing some sensitive intelligence regarding violations of the agreement, infiltration by Hezbollah into the Lebanese armed forces. It also, very importantly, recognizes Israel's right to respond to threats coming from Lebanese territory. If it's in the southern part of Lebanon, they have the right to act at any time against these violations. In other parts of Lebanon, they have the right to act if the Lebanese government is unable or unwilling to do this. And the other aspect of this side letter is that Israel maintains the right to fly over Lebanon for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance purposes. So that's basically what's in this agreement. So why would Israel do it? What were the benefits? Sort of the obvious is you've had reservists who have been away from their families fighting for hundreds of days, and this will provide them some time off, very necessary time off, help with families, sort of get back to normal life. For the Israeli military, it will allow for a replenishment of weapons that are sorely needed, and those are due to the delays from the US government in not sending Israel what they should have. There's a $680 million arms sales package, which includes thousands of JDAMs. JDAMs are Joint Direct Attack Munitions. These are basically guidance kits which take a dumb bomb and add precision-guided munitions to turn them into a smart bomb. So when you drop it, it's going to hit the exact location and limit collateral damage. One of the other major benefits for Israel is they can focus on Iran, because Hezbollah had served essentially as Iran's wild card in defense from Israel going after Iran's nuclear program. And now that Hezbollah does not pose that threat to Israel, Israel can shift its focus to Iran. Hezbollah is severely weakened. It's not the same threat as it was prior to that Beeper attack. Israel continues to disrupt the weapons smuggling from Iran through Syria. And one of the other potential benefits is the residents of Israel in the north being able to return home. That's still to be determined. I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about that aspect. And then probably the biggest thing that's in the news right now is the fact that Hezbollah had said that they would not agree to a ceasefire unless there was a ceasefire in Gaza. And now they have, which has separated the war in Gaza from the war in the north. And we're hearing conversations now that there's negotiations about a ceasefire in Gaza and a hostage release, and we'll see what comes from it. But that is definitely a big benefit, that Hamas has lost some of its bargaining power. And so where do things stand? And I'll wrap up with this, and then let's get some conversation. Hezbollah fired 2 mortar shells into Israel on Monday. The Israeli Air Force has carried out strikes on rocket launchers on multiple occasions in southern Lebanon, including today. Terrorists killed in southern Lebanon near a church. The US and France have criticized Israel for not keeping the ceasefire agreement. You've got Prime Minister Netanyahu, the Foreign Minister Gideon Sa'ar, military spokesman, being very clear, saying, we will enforce this ceasefire with zero tolerance. You've got the United States intel reports came out in Reuters that Hezbollah is rebuilding, recruiting new fighters, rearming through domestic production and smuggling through Syria. I think the best way to describe this ceasefire is it's working really well if Israel is going to enforce it. And if not, then we're going to have another situation where a fourth Lebanon war will be in the offing. So with that, I will yield back and look forward to having a conversation.
Okay, so let's unpack a little bit. One of the really important things is that the United States and France have criticized Israel for fighting back. The actual criticism was, you shot back, you didn't report the violations. You were supposed to report the violations. I would suggest that reporting the violations to UNIFIL all of those years is precisely what led to the situation you have now. Nobody was enforcing anything. Israel wasn't able to enforce anything. So all this reporting is a bunch of garbage. And leaving the Lebanese armed forces to take care of the actual enforcement, which is what the agreement says, not what Israel says, but what the agreement says, is that the Lebanese armed forces, which are in fact paid for by us and have received some training from us, and we have supported them, which may or may not be a good idea, leaving it to them to enforce is a non-starter. So Deputy IDF Chief Yair Golan says that Hezbollah understands all of this, number one, and they are trying to work around the edges to make sure that they stay on the inside and Israel gets blamed for everything. How do you think that's going to work? In your view, is Israel actually going to take the initiative to enforce the terms? And what does that mean to Israel's relationship with the United States and the Lebanese armed forces?
So I think it's very important to look at the statements that Israeli leadership are making today. Israel has learned many lessons from the failure on October 7th. I think one of the most important lessons that Israel has learned is that there is no substitute for Israel's defense other than Israel. And a ceasefire is great. It's great to stop the fighting, but this is what happened in 2006. And there were minor things, some Hezbollah starting to return, a tent popping up, little things that violated the agreement, but was it that big of a deal to end a ceasefire? And what Israel, at least right now, is being very clear about is any minor violation of this ceasefire, we are enforcing. And you mentioned about the criticism that Israel's not going through the mechanism of this committee of reporting to the US and to France about the violations. This committee, as I understand, met today for the first time. So if you've got these minor violations happening and it's going to take time for these meetings to happen, I mean, you know how it works. You got a bureaucratic meeting. Well, it's not that big of a deal. We'll deploy UNIFIL to go try to stop this, or the Lebanese armed forces will go in. And nothing happens, and it's now been a week or 2 weeks, and where are you? You're now in a situation where Hezbollah knows there's no enforcement mechanism. So Israel's position, I think, is a shift from how they operated in the past. I definitely think that the political situation in this country plays into it. And you've got a 60-day time period for Israel to withdraw from southern Lebanon. By that point, there will be a new president in the United States. I would say what we have today is relative calm, and I think Hezbollah is testing to see what's going to happen. And if Israel maintains its very strong position that any minor violation, especially in southern Lebanon, Israel is going to act immediately, I think we'll see that Hezbollah's tune may change a bit.
I would think so, and I would hope so. And one of the reasons that I hope so is because this is a learning curve for Israel, among other things. The entire concept of Hamas and Hezbollah building tunnels under spaces that they controlled and bringing weapons in from Syria and bringing weapons in from Qatar and all of those things. The Israelis knew, more or less, give or take, what was going on in both of those spaces, but there was a point at which they didn't want to upset the apple cart either. And I don't say that as criticism, because those apple carts are very serious things. You know, it has to do with the lives of your people. It has to do with people shooting at you as opposed to digging underground. But I think one of the things Israel has learned is that you can only wait so long. And at some point you can't ignore it, and you can't say the immediate calm is worth the price later. So I agree with you. I expect Israel to take every one of those violations seriously. And maybe that will influence Hezbollah's future action. But I think the other thing that influences Hezbollah's future actions, and we're going to turn to the Syrian front in a minute, is that it's clear now that Hezbollah was perceived to be a much stronger and more capable force than it proved to be. One afternoon of pager explosions, plus a couple of other things, proved to everybody, including to Iran, and including to Iran's friends and enemies, that Israel may in fact be the strong horse of the region, not Iran and not Hezbollah. But now you still have to worry, because as you point out, Hezbollah is looking to regroup, and it's not going to be able to regroup very well in southern Lebanon. And so there are already reports of Hezbollah moving into Beirut, at least the officers of the Hezbollah Corps, and buying homes in Beirut and buying buildings in Beirut. Where are they getting that money? Possibly Qatar, which will hold, you know, major implications for the United States and its relations with Qatar, a major non-NATO ally. But you can see Hezbollah wiggling in every possible direction to find a new landing spot. Is it possible? Let's do one of those big shifts. Is it possible that the war in Syria will make it that much more difficult for Hezbollah to find a landing spot in which it is feared by the people? At this moment, after the pagers, I think people didn't really fear Hezbollah nearly as much as it did before the pagers. In fact, they laughed at them.
So if I forget to come back, redirect me, please. But I wanted to hit one more point about the response to to the ceasefire, how Israel's responding. I mentioned before about a potential benefit is that people who have been displaced from their homes for over a year in the north could return home. They are not going to return home until they believe that they are actually safe. Not that Hezbollah is going to be more limited in the south, but they want to know that they're going to be able to rebuild their homes, rebuild their communities, move back. I mean, a lot of these homes have been destroyed, schools, and actually start building their lives again. And if there is the perception that this ceasefire is not going to be implemented fully, those people aren't returning home, and Israel's got a big problem. So and we're seeing this from across most of the political spectrum in Israel, there is strong support for, I would say, implementing this ceasefire completely, and with Israel making sure that it's not broken. And if there's a break, Israel responds quickly, swiftly, and puts it right back on track. So I think that's a very important aspect of it from the Israeli perspective, is they have to give confidence to the people that they can move back north.
So let me add to that. One of the interesting phenomena that you see in Lebanon is that families from South Lebanon are returning to South Lebanon, which means that they trust that Israel is not going to do anything really terrible to them. They are returning to their homes because they believe Hezbollah has been pushed out. Now, there's a lot of moaning and wailing in South Lebanon among the civilian population, and they're saying, my home is destroyed and my business is destroyed and my everything is destroyed. I don't know what they thought in the old days when Hezbollah was putting all that stuff under their houses. But it does seem to me there's a big difference in the two civilian populations. The Israelis are not going home until they are fully confident that the Israelis have the thing in hand for them. Oh, maybe it's the same thing. The South Lebanese are going home because they believe the Israelis have things fully in hand. So both sides are relying on Israel to keep it safe for them. And I just find that amusing.
I think it's also very important that to note, because the Lebanese people realize that this is not a war between Israel and Lebanon, at least not now.
Right.
It's a war between Israel and Hezbollah. And if Israel wanted to attack the Lebanese people, again, they have the capability and capacity to do it. That's not their intent. They're looking to live in peace, but you've got to eradicate an enemy that seeks your destruction. So I think that indication of the people in southern Lebanon returning to their homes is indicative of that point, that Israel is not a threat to them. Hezbollah is the threat that they face.
Now, if the people of Gaza could come up with the same theory that the threat to them is their Hamas occupiers and not the state of Israel, all these wars could end much more quickly.
Yes.
But instead of ending, of course, the wars are growing. And now we have another one. And by the way, I mentioned that Israel has become seen a little bit as the strong horse in the region, and Iran's position has been eroded. Hezbollah's position has been eroded, Hamas's position. They're trying to figure out how to blame Israel for the war in Syria. See, it's Israel's fault because it upset the balance of forces. And so whatever happens in Syria is Israel's fault. This is the new line among those who simply don't like Israel.
Yes. The war in Syria, or I guess you could sort of say the continuation of the civil war in Syria, which had sort of, had a ceasefire for a while, and it's now started up again. I think it just shows the impact that both the war that Israel's been fighting against Hezbollah and Iran, as well as Russia's war with Ukraine, has had on the dynamics in the region. Because what you essentially had was Russia, Iran, Turkey coming to sort of an agreement on Syria. And what we are now seeing is Turkey apparently giving the green light to call them the rebel forces in Syria to make their gains. Turkey has its own purposes here. I've read and spoken to people who said, what's Turkey's end game here? Number one, it's to keep the Kurds at bay, no independence for the Syrian Kurds that can upset the Turkish Kurdish population, and they want to maintain that aspect of it. And they've also got many, many refugees from the civil war in Turkey that, quite frankly, they don't want. And you're also looking at the power dynamics here of Erdogan in Turkey, who views himself as the leader, really the new leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, if you will, and trying to reestablish, an Ottoman Caliphate type idea, not to spread across the region like the Caliphate was, but that idea of the central point being in Turkey, and that he should be the leader of it and trying to exert some regional dominance. And you've got a situation now where Iran had been that strong force in the region with its proxies, all across the region, that are now systematically being reduced to, in some cases, a mere nuisance, and other cases still a formidable threat, but one that could, with political will, be dealt with quickly, whether we're talking about the Houthis in Yemen, forces in Iraq, even the remaining aspects of Hezbollah. So you've got this interesting dynamic playing out there. And for Hezbollah and Iran, really for Iran, they have invested many billions of dollars into building this protection and force projection against Israel. And as my friend Rich Goldberg has said, now they have no protection left. Israel, if it wanted to, could carry out strikes anywhere in Iran. So what have they gotten for that massive investment? As they look around and see second Trump administration coming in, likely, putting the hammer down on their finances and oil revenues. I mean, they're in a very tough spot, and it's almost as if Syria is standing between them and potential additional damage to their regime.
I think that's totally true. This may be the last forward basing of Iran. But to focus on Turkey for a minute, I think you made a couple of really important points. I'm going to disagree with just one of them. They're not just supporting those jihadists politically, they are arming them and they are training them. And we are very clear that the Turks have supplied military equipment to the Sunni jihadists, and some of it is ours. And we in the United States have to take a serious look. Turkey is a NATO ally, or let's just say a NATO country. I don't know if it qualifies as an ally. And many people have asked me, so I'll say it, can we throw Turkey out of NATO? The answer is no. NATO is a unanimous vote to get in and a unanimous vote to get out. So you can't throw the Turks out, and the Turks don't want to be thrown out because they're collecting the weapons. So the question for NATO will be, and certainly for the United States will be, does Turkey have to be punished for what it's doing here? And then how are you going to do that? So that's what Turkey is. But you also said something I thought was very important. Turkey, or Erdogan at least, I don't want to say the Turkish people or the Turkish nation. Erdogan is operating at two levels. He is the Muslim Brotherhood guy, which puts him immediately at odds, because that's a Sunni thing, with the Iranians, who are Shiites. But it's also an Ottoman Empire thing, which is not religious, but is actually physical. The Ottoman Empire owned Syria at one point. The Ottoman Empire owned all of the Middle East at one point. And Erdogan wants that back. So he's operating both at the religious level as the Muslim Brotherhood guy, and he's operating at the Ottoman level because he's a Turk and he sees it coming. And you now see, by the way, Uzbek and Tajik and other Sunni Islamists who have come to Syria to try to oust the Shiite Iranians and Hezbollah. And for the moment, I think they're winning. We're going to have to talk about Russia in a minute, which is a whole separate issue. Apparently, Iranian forces have left Homs, which is a big city and a big win for the Sunnis, and how that's going to impact Syria and ultimately impact Israel, because there is an ironic report, and I don't think they meant it to be ironic, that Assad has tried reaching out to Israel and saying, well, what if we get rid of the Iranians? Can we find a way to, can you help me stay in power if we get rid of the Iranians? Is it a joke? What does Israel think, in your view, of the possibility that you lose Assad, who nobody wants, nobody likes, and his Iranian masters, but you replace them with an increasingly volatile and nasty Turkey, which, by the way, just another point, has been bombing the Kurds relentlessly for the last, month or 6 weeks, and cut off their water. So Turkey's in the middle of committing major war crimes. On the other hand, they're not Iran. How does Israel figure out what to do with this?
Well, yeah, that's an easy answer.
It is.
Thanks for that question. Now, the Israelis are sort of in a similar situation to where they were when the Civil War started, which is, better that they're fighting each other than fighting against us. But if you're Israel now, you laid out the issue here. You've got the Assad regime, which has been propped up by the Russians, by Iran with Hezbollah, allowing smuggling, weaponry to get to Hezbollah. And the alternative right now is this group, essentially HTS, which is I believe it was Al-Qaeda in Syria. It's a Sunni jihadist group. That is a much more dangerous proposition. I mean, that is what Hamas is, a Sunni jihadist group. It is that religious Islamic, jihadist focus. So that is an enemy that, if it chooses to focus on Israel, is not going to be deterred by the international community's promises or whims or offers. It's integral to their identity. On the other hand, you're dealing with Iran and Hezbollah. And right now, what I read this morning was Israel took out, up in the northern part of Syria, took out some facility that apparently a research facility, military facility that may have been producing chemical weapons, and they wanted to make sure that that did not get into the hands of these rebel forces. So I think from Israel's perspective right now, it's operating where necessary to protect Israel's security in the future. But like they did when the Civil War started, hands off, not their war. Regarding the reports about Assad reaching out for help, and it's a good dovetail to the Russian question, which is, what can Assad do? In theory, sure, he reaches out, says, I'll agree to push out Iran. I'll disassociate. With what, an end goal of a peace deal between Israel and Syria? Great, but Assad doesn't control Syria. He controls parts of Syria. Israel's not going to send in its forces into Syria to fight against these enemies. So what exactly are they getting with Assad? And, even taking it to that next level and connecting in Russia here, Israel and Russia, I don't know I think you could argue they are friendly.
Yes.
They are certainly working together. While Russia and Iran have their relationship, certainly on the military side, between weapons from Russia going to Iran and vice versa. When it comes to Syria, Russia has sided with Israel and make sure not to be in areas where Hezbollah is operating, because Israel's going to take them out. There's some relationship there on the military level to ensure Russians aren't accidentally hit in a strike. So, Israel's had a lot of freedom in Syria because of the relationship with Russia, and losing that would definitely complicate things for Israel. I don't want to say harm, but it would certainly complicate Israel's freedom of operation.
Yeah, that's, in my opinion, Russia has to be separated from the interests of the Syrian government and the Iranian government, because, as it always does, Russia has its own interests. Russian participation in the Syrian civil war netted them naval bases, Tartus and Latakia, and the Haifa air base near the port of Latakia, and they want to keep those, number one. They're not going to keep those if the Sunni jihadists take over. Russia hates Sunni jihad because the Chechen wars were all about Sunni jihad. The first Chechen war was ginned actually by Saudi Arabia. The second one had other kinds of roots, but the Russians, remember, the Russians killed an extraordinary number of people in Chechnya, civilians and military. At one point, the UN said that Grozny, the capital of Chechnya, was the most destroyed city on the planet. Okay, so that's what Russia does. That's what genocide looks like. That's what war crimes look like. I'm never going to defend the Russian mechanism for waging war. However, what you learn from that is what's important to the Russians. They don't want Sunni jihadists. They don't mind Israel. They like Israel. Israel has not done for Ukraine. It's, we're going to now extend this war to Europe and Ukraine. They have not done what the Ukrainians asked. The Israelis haven't. And one of the reasons they haven't The first reason is because Ukraine asked for things that Israel could not have given them without limiting its own self-defense and offensive capabilities at home. They don't have it to give. But secondly, they did not want to have that fight with Russia. And the Russians understand that. Russia has a good relationship with Prime Minister Netanyahu, had a very good relationship, by the way, with Prime Minister Bennett when in his short term there. Bennett was willing to be a mediator in the Ukraine war, and the Russians saw him and the Ukrainians saw him. So Russia and Israel have a relationship that's different than any other two parties in the Middle East. And so it depends now. I mean, I wrote recently that, holding my nose, that you almost have to root for the Russians, because the guys who hate the Sunni Islamists and the guys who hate the Shia Islamists and the guys who work with Israel for the moment are the Russians. So I don't know where that's going to go. And the Russians certainly don't want to prioritize Syria because they have other priorities. I don't know, it looks to me like the Israelis have to be crossing their fingers for the Russians. And that just is not the norm, There's nothing normal about any of this.
No, not much to add on that. I think I would say I agree with you on where things stand from an Israeli perspective. From a U.S. perspective, I would just add that we still have troops there fighting against ISIS.
Very important point.
Yeah.
Talk about our troops. Where are our troops? Because that is going to come up in a second in a question.
Well, I mean, this is part of this whole challenge. If we've got Turkey, who's part of NATO, so they're part of an alliance with us, yet they're supporting these rebel forces, many of which are people that we're fighting against. And how you square that, it puts the U.S. also in a very difficult position, which is likely, unless something happens quite quick, something that the incoming administration is going to have to deal with, which is how to balance fighting against these forces in Syria versus, you're not going to work with the Russians. That's a challenge. So I mean, I don't really have an answer to that. I just think there's that aspect of it, I think, has been largely missing from the conversation in Syria, is the fact that, we still do have troops there and we have an enemy there. And, that has to become part of, from a U.S. policy perspective, part of the conversation.
So this goes to two questions that have come in from people who are listening. What are we doing? Why are we doing it? And should we stop doing it? That's a U.S. question. We're there because we were there during the ISIS war. We were there to prevent the movement of weapons and people from northern Iraq into Syria and Syria into northern Iraq, and to protect the Kurds, among other things. The Kurds are friends of the United States and should be, and the Kurds are also friends of Israel. So there was some kind of thought in the United States that all of these things could be done together, that we would defend the border between Iraq and Syria, that we would prevent things from going across, and we would try to protect our Kurdish friends. Now, this goes along with a question about what the new administration might choose to do. The first Trump administration had planned to leave Afghanistan, feeling that our presence there, small as it was and limited as it was not a good thing for the United States. The president was then talked out of that by the military, who explained that if we left, it would unleash forces that would be bad for the United States. First of all, bad for Afghanistan and bad for the people that we had worked with, but also bad for the United States in the long run. The president was dissuaded, and the Trump administration did not withdraw from Afghanistan. The Biden administration did, and they did it in the most thoughtless, careless, hasty, ill-prepared manner that one can imagine. And aside from the wreckage that they left behind, if you look at Afghanistan today, it is a disaster. It is a disaster for the people, certainly for the women. And in the geopolitical sense, the Taliban has been reactivated to its role as international terror supporter. Taliban is arming and training and doing all kinds of nasty things. So if you look at the small contingent of US forces that are between Syria and Iraq, there also was some thought that the Trump administration would want to remove that presence because it just sits there. I suspect that the Afghan experience will influence their thinking heavily and may result in us staying for fear that, again, forces that we may be the finger in the dike, that if we take our finger out of the dike, it's only going to exacerbate the problem. On the other hand, President Trump, incoming President Trump, has had a relationship with Turkey's President Erdogan that is not hostile, has never been hostile. Of course, that was before Turkey was arming Sunni jihadists, so I don't know how that's going to go. But the US position remains to be seen. I do suspect that from the US side, we are not going to have any hasty withdrawal of US forces, because I think we've seen what happens when we do that without proper, I don't know, proper respect for the level of intensity of the bad guys. I don't know how to say that without making the bad guys sound good, but we have to be aware of our presence is small, but it has a major impact on the players. And I think maybe it's going to stay there for a while.
Yeah, I think it's also important to see how things play out over the next week or two. These rebel forces are moving quite fast and approaching Damascus. They're getting closer, and reports that Iran is sending troops from Iraq, to come in. I mean, we'll see what happens there, but if Damascus were to fall, well, that changes everything.
Yes.
And I think this is a conversation, I think from the US side also is, I hope that the Trump foreign policy team that's planning on, that's already been announced to come in, and those involved in those discussions are discussing already what our policy might look like depending on these circumstances. Because, I mean, this could reignite the the revolutions that we saw not too long ago in the Middle East. And I would say that many just viewed this as that happened and it stopped. Syria was sort of the one country that should have been overthrown if you looked at these other countries with the Arab Revolution, and they didn't. They survived it, but they didn't survive it. It was put on pause, and it's now operating again all these years later. The Arab Spring. So I think this is something that will play out over the next few weeks. I don't think there's really an answer yet. And I think from Israel's perspective, and really from the United States as well, in some ways, it's an opportunity to really put a hammer down on Iran and Hezbollah to have a little more freedom of action, especially along the border with Lebanon, to ensure nothing's able to get in.
So it's interesting. If Iran, I also saw the reports that Iran is sending reinforcements to its guys. The implication of the article I read was that they were coming from Iran. The implication that you read is that they're coming from Iraq, and you know that Iran has troops in Iraq. If you wanted to move troops from Iraq to Syria, you have to go through the US. I mean, that's where we're sitting. So I don't know about that one. If I were the Iranians, do I want to take my troops and try to cross into Syria that way? I don't know. And if I'm doing it from Iran, where's the weaponry going to come from? They have troops, they have soldiers. They're not a particularly well-armed military. So if you send them from Iraq, they probably have their weapons with them. But a major invasion of Iranian forces with weapons into Syria, that would be, I think, beyond their capability. So some of that, I suspect, is just Iranian talk. I think the whole thing, the linchpin of the whole thing, is whether Russia decides to protect Assad or not. We have a question from a listener asking if Israel will try to protect Assad. I think it's very difficult to imagine Israel voluntarily opening a new front. You can disagree with me if you want.
I'd be very surprised if Israel actively was supporting helping Assad. Uh, Depending on Israeli calculations, maybe there could be some assistance in some way back channeling, but I would be shocked if there was some type of open engagement where Israel was supporting Assad. I did want to raise something that you and I have talked about a little bit, and there were some reports at the end of October. First came out in Al Akbar, which is a pro-Hezbollah Arab paper in Lebanon. It was cited by Israel Hayom that the US ambassador to Lebanon, Lisa Johnson, was meeting with Lebanese government and urging them to take this opportunity to kick out Hezbollah. And now, I've not seen this reported in other places, but, it was, this is your opportunity. We will support you. We will work to topple the Iranian regime. There is an opportunity to reclaim your country. Regardless of whether or not that is accurate, I think that idea, though, merits some attention and consideration, because there is an opportunity in Lebanon to try to fix what is broken. And not saying nation building on the part of the United States. Don't get me wrong here. That is not our forte. But looking at the region, looking at, say, the Emirates, the Saudis, perhaps there is an opportunity regionally to engage with Lebanon with the proper will, with the resources, to deal with this Hezbollah problem. It's not going to be a quick fix, clearly. Hezbollah is embedded throughout the country through their institutions. How do you differentiate between Hezbollah as an entity and the Hezbollah member who also happens to work at the bank? There's big issues that need to be dealt with. But when we look at Lebanon and we look at the ceasefire today and what it's calling for, even the fact that the Lebanese government supported the idea of the United States essentially being the main arbiter of what's a ceasefire violation, to me, lends some credence to this idea that there are people within Lebanon who recognize there's a potential future for Lebanon to throw on the political hat to be great again. And if only there could be the support to remove this threat that they face from Iran and Hezbollah. So, I just think that is something when we look from a U.S. perspective, what is our end game with Lebanon? Ultimately, it should be a peace deal between Israel and Lebanon. It should be Lebanon become part of the Abraham Accords. Again, we're talking some time into the future, but from a policy perspective and what we are going to do, both as a Congress, the new administration, working with international partners, there needs to be an actual focus on fixing for the future, not maintaining the status quo, so that at some point in the future, we're talking about the fourth Lebanon war, more people dead, more people displaced, more destruction, because without that, who's going to have any interest in rebuilding in Lebanon? Who's going to invest resources if Hezbollah is going to eventually rebuild itself?
Okay, so here I'm going to make myself a very old person because we had this conversation. I love your thinking because you need a positive end game in order to decide I'm going to fight this war because something positive has to come out of it. And Lebanon has all the resources to be a positive factor. Lebanon was once a great country in the region. Beirut was called the Paris of the Middle East. it's not like they don't know how to do this. The Lebanese, they actually do know how to do it. And what we had talked about was something called the Good Fence. After the 1982 Israeli incursion into Lebanon, with their Lebanese partners, which was called, I forgot what they were called now. Anyway, it's the Army of South Lebanon, which was a Christian militia, which helped Israel to get rid of the bad guys and create a peaceful situation in southern Lebanon. They opened the border every day between Lebanon and northern Israel, and people would come into Israel from Lebanon. They would work in the factories. I was there on one of my first military trips in September of 1982. There was a Lebanese couple sitting in an Israeli hotel. They had just gotten married and they were going to honeymoon in Metula. Okay. Now, what does it tell you? First of all, it tells you that relations are possible. But secondly, what it tells you is that the Lebanese people, there has to be enforcement on their side of whatever happens. The Army of South Lebanon was willing to enforce the terms with Israel on both sides of the border. So the Israelis were safe and the southern Lebanese were safe to say, yes, I want to work with Israel. I want to have trade. I want to benefit southern Lebanon. And I actually believe that the US ambassador might have said those things that you credit her with saying, because that's what the US should be aiming at. And that is to get rid of these guys and to create a situation in which you can go not forward, but actually backward, back to the situation where Israel and Lebanon were able to talk to each other and the Lebanese were able to enter Israel and the thing worked for the people. Because really you want it to be for the people, not for the militias. Now, the problem I have with it, and I always like to end on a positive note, and I thought you were giving me the positive note. You are giving a positive note. But the negative side of that is it won't work unless you completely uproot the bad guys. The uprooting of the bad guys is the crucial element here. And if they're moving into Beirut and they're burrowing themselves into the population of Beirut, not just the South, the war's going to get bigger before it gets smaller. So here's your choice, EJ, as we end the program. And I say thank you very much because this has been terrific. You've given us a ton to think about. What do you think? Is it possible to do this in a way that liberates the people of Lebanon, which then might be seen as an opportunity to liberate the people of the Gaza Strip or liberate the people of Syria? Can this be a force for positive regional change? How much of an optimist do you want to be here?
So I'm going to be an optimist. And first, thank you for having me on. This has been enjoyable, like always when you and I get together and chat. I'm also going to actually plug something that we USIEA have actually been working on, which I think provides this positive light. It's something called the AGES, Alternate Gazan Education System, which is to replace UNRWA's role in the education space in Gaza with a new entity, bringing in international partners, the UAE, Saudi, who have reformed their education systems, putting in place something more robust, transparency, accountability, to rebuild an education system, obviously when the situation is right, to build up a society that actually looks towards coexistence and not conflict. And that's beyond just education. It's institution building, it's everything. But in Lebanon, ultimately, that is a similar situation that could be deployed there because it requires education, and it requires from the institutions themselves that as a society, these are the things that they stand for. In meetings with senior officials from the UAE, this is what they said. It's not just the curriculum. It's not just the textbooks. This is who we are as a people. This is what we believe in. These are our institutional beliefs. So it permeates the entire society. And that's what I think can possibly lead to a positive future. And I'll end on that note.
So if you can make a comparison between the UAE of the present and the potential for Lebanon in the future, I think that's a great note to go out on, because before the Abraham Accords, nobody would have bet on the UAE either. And they've come out as an amazing force for good in the region. And maybe some of that will spread to Lebanon. I think we're going to stop here because we are both sitting on an optimistic note, and I like that. And again, EJ, our thanks. This has been terrific. Thank you for doing it.
My pleasure. Thank you.